Hey guys, in today's video, we're going to do the installation instructions for the 79 to 95 Toyota pickup and 4Runner rear disc brake conversion kit. So this is the pretty much end product over here. The only thing I haven't done yet is reformed my hard line to connect my stainless braided hose. I'm waiting to get some new U-bolts and U-bolt plates and maybe even swap leaf springs on the rear of this particular truck before I do that. Everything else though is done on this end. So this axle's already been built, so I'm not going to be able to show you the first steps, but I am going to show you the installation of my parts that actually bolt on. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the drum cover. You can either smack it, you can leave a couple lug nuts loosely just on the end, put the truck up on jack stands like this if it's driving, and then slam on the brakes, and a lot of times that causes the drum to come off, and then the lug nuts prevent the drum from flying away. There's also going to be, like you can see even in here, some M8 slotted, some M8 threaded holes. You can put a pair of M8 bolts in there and thread them in evenly, just a little bit at a time, and that'll mechanically press the drum cover off. So once you get that off, you can strip as much of it off as you can. There's still going to be a backing plate. Here's a Dodge assembly, so you can see kind of what I'm talking about. This is the backing plate. You're going to have 4 holes. That's actually attached from the back side of the axle shaft. We have to use a hydraulic press to get that part off. So once you get to that point, then we're actually going to remove the axle shaft. So these are the bolts I'm talking about. There's nuts on this side and there's studs that go through, and you're going to take these nuts off, and then you're going to slide this whole axle shaft out. So at that point we do need a hydraulic press and a fixture to remove the backing plate from the back side of this axle shaft. I would highly recommend you get everything lined up beforehand, get new wheel bearings and seals and everything so that you can completely service this axle, because this is a fairly labor intensive process and it's not something that you're just going to do, you know, casually during an oil change. This axle here has 160,000 miles on it. I've never touched the bearings or the seals in it. The bearings were still good. They were starting to get a little bit loose, but the seals definitely needed replaced. So I went ahead, I did all that. I sandblasted and painted everything, so it's ready for our final assembly now. And the nice thing about this is you can use M8 bolts to bolt your axle shaft back in while you paint your whole axle assembly like I did here. And then we can come back, take these sacrificial bolts out, and put our final hardware in. That way everything looks nice and clean, like we actually intended for it to come out this way. So speaking of the fixture for the hydraulic press, you can use your backing plate to make the fixture. I actually had purchased a used axle with a homemade disc brake conversion kit on it, and that's actually kind of how this whole idea spawned. More on that in a second, but I used that plate to make my base because that has to bolt to this guy here. And then you need spacer tubes, and you need something to set in your press, and then you press the axle shaft out of this cup. So anyway, you can home make something like this, like I did here. This was, you know, free with scrap, or I have a link on the web page. It's 40 or 50 bucks off eBay, which is pretty affordable, honestly, for what it is, for how much goes into making one of these. So you can make that determination yourself. So now I'll give you the backstory on how I developed this kit, or why I needed to develop this kit. So this truck, this is my 84, and I wanted 33-inch tires that would tuck inside the fenders. So that's going to be a 33 10.5. And I wanted 15-inch wheels. I want the Back to the Future wheels. So with the kit on this truck that was homemade, it was so sloppy, it actually didn't line up right. things were angled instead of being parallel. It's pretty unsafe, and as you can see here, this caliper is all rusted and nasty, and I have no idea what the parts were because nothing was documented and there's no part numbers on anything that I can see. So I was kind of stuck. Not to mention the rotors were actually modified, and so I needed new rotors, and I don't even know what rotors they were. I eventually figured it out. They were some GM rotors, but they actually milled down the rotor, so it was thinner, so it would work with this caliper, whatever this caliper is. It was below the minimum tolerance thickness of that rotor, so it was unsafe. That rotor could have come apart how thin it was. So I said, you know what, I'm just going to go with a different kit. Well, every other kit that I found required you to do all the same stuff, but you'd have to press the stud. You'd put the rotor on the back side of the hub, and you press the studs through it. So if you ever wanted to service your rotor, it was a huge pain because you had to take these 4 bolts out, you had to slide the axle shaft out, you had to press all these studs back out just to get to your rotor. Now anything modern has a slip-on rotor, so it slips over the hub. It's hub-centric, so it lines up tightly over this hub. Now that's another thing about rotors going on the back side, is you're relying on this stud to be pressed in tightly into the rotor and the hub to keep it centered on your axle. Now with the slip-over style, it centers off this, just like a dually wheel would. And obviously we can just slip it off when we need to service it. So that's a major plus. So the rotor that I'm using happens to be the same thickness here as the drum that we took off. So with the other kits, you're either going to have to use different studs, because you can see there's no thread right there. So you're either going to have to use different length studs, or you're going to have to use wheel spacers. But with my kit, your wheels don't know that you did anything different from changing your drums out, because the rotor thickness is the same as the drum that you took off. So that's a huge perk, and it also allows us to use these maximum backspaced wheels. To get the wheels tucked in, I needed a 4.5-inch backspace wheel. I believe we can go up to 4 3/4 backspacing. It also allows us to use both steel and aluminum, 15-inch wheels. Most kits out there are going to require you to use a 16-inch or larger wheel or minimal backspacing. My kit was focused solely around making this tire and wheel combination work with this truck and fit inside the fenders. That was not the only focus. Cost is another huge factor. When I built this axle in 2011, I wanted to do the disc conversion then, but I couldn't afford it. Everything was so expensive, and everything was using really dated parts from the 60s and 70s, like these GM and Eldorado calipers. So there's no reason we shouldn't be using parts from the 2000s. Everything made now is bigger, works better, there's more technology. For example, this rotor is E-coated, which is different from zinc. It's E-coated. That's something specific to automotive brake parts that I found. So it's not going to sit there and rust right away. Calipers, they're zinc plated, so they're not going to look like this after getting rained on once. I'm also using the largest diameter rotor that I could find, which is 12.25 inch, and the caliper itself is a single piston. And we don't want a massive dual piston caliper in the back, because after all, this is still a Toyota pickup. We don't want to have to run Hydro Boost just to power the rear brakes. The perk of a large diameter rotor is you get more leverage the further out you go. That's why now in 2025, all these vehicles coming out are running larger and larger diameter wheels. That's so you can run a larger diameter rotor, so you get more leverage on your brakes and you can stop better. So if you look at all the other kits out on the market, they're using shorter rotors, which gives you less leverage for your brakes. Now, as far as the parking brake goes, the Eldorado style and I believe there's also a GM style. That's just using a cable to pull your brake pads together. Whereas when we're actually using the service brakes, we are hydraulically, going through our hydraulic line to clamp that. And that's a massive difference. What everyone has done starting I believe in the 90s is when I first started seeing this used. This is actually a drum on the inside of this rotor. So the shoe will press against this. So I have not adapted that onto this because there are so many parts to adapt to make that work. It would be cost prohibitive. At that point, you'd be better off just going out and buying a modern day axle that's already set up, because you're just going to be money and time ahead. That's how modern stuff works. You have the rotor for the calipers for your service brakes, and it has an internal drum brake just for your parking brake. So we're not going to be using the parking brake on the end of the axle. So that leaves us essentially with two options. We can use a transfer case brake, where it's just another rotor and a caliper coming off the output of your transfer case or transmission. There's two major problems with those. Number one is vibration. Those kits that are out there are not precision made. They're sloppy and they're highly prone to vibration at high speeds. And I plan to be taking this truck up to at least 88 miles per hour. I mean, you have to. It's out just for that reason. But also, if you have an open rear end, which allows one wheel to spin while the other one is, essentially connected to your drive shaft. If you ever park on a hill and one wheel starts to spin, it can start walking down the hill like this. And a lot of times it ends up flipping and rolling if it's on a steep enough and big enough hill. So it's pretty dangerous. I would rather use a line lock. And for a line lock, we have two main options. Here's the extremely affordable option from Speedway. It's less than $40. You just push and pull on this thing, and that locks it. You have in and out. Super simple. Two mounting holes. This is what I'll be using on this tan Toyota pickup. Here's your much more expensive option. This guy has this lever that goes up and down, and it also has wires that tie into your parking brake circuitry, so that if it's on, your parking brake lights up so you don't try taking off with your brakes engaged. I actually made this with a hand drill and an angle grinder back in college, so this is pretty crude, but I eventually plan to adapt this guy with some nice CNC parts to make this fit more sleek and keep it up off your leg and tucked up nice and tight in the dash here. You do have to run your hydraulic brake lines through this because it's essentially a selectable check valve. Now this truck's been sitting in my shop for 2 years and I forgot that I had it on, and when I took this off the lift I noticed the line lock was still engaged, and in 2 years time it still did not bleed pressure off. Now they are more expensive, they're over $300, but that's a true testament to how well that works at holding your pressure. 2 years this thing did not leak pressure down. The other thing we're going to have to add is an adjustable proportioning valve so we can change our bias from our front to our rear. This is just a cheap Willwood unit. Works great. You dial it in and pretty much set it and forget it. Now the factory had an LSPV, or a load sensing and proportioning valve, and all it really was, it wasn't really sensing anything, it was just a proportioning valve that, depending on what angle it was at, would determine how much flow was going to go to your rear brakes. So the way that system worked is, if you had more weight in your bed and your bed started to tilt down, it would change how much fluid could go to your rear brakes. Lots of them didn't work, especially as old as they are now, so it's pretty easy to justify deleting that and going to an adjustable Willwood, even if you aren't doing this rear disc brake conversion. Even if you just keep your stock drum brakes, it's still worth adding in the Willwood system. Now technically, if you were going to haul heavy, you'd want to go probably adjust your Willwood proportioning valve. And if you're going to do that, I'd probably just put some paint marks on there to show you where to set it for empty and heavy. It's a Toyota pickup though. You're probably going to be using a full-size pickup if you're really moving something heavy. And I've never had to adjust mine, so I set it once and forget it. But if you do need more rear braking power when you have weight on the rear end and you have some traction to actually use those brakes, you can certainly crawl down there and increase the bias to the rear with that nice Willwood adjustable unit. So I think that should cover everything up to this point. You get the axle shaft disassembled, painted, and slid back in. Do be very careful that you hold the shaft centered and parallel with the axle housing when you insert this so you don't destroy your new oil seal that's inside there. These washers I had on here just because to move this around, this wasn't threaded all the way, and so I wasn't able to tighten my lug nuts all the way with the wheel on. So these were just to kind of simulate the drum or the rotor as far as the spacing. So you start with just your clean, empty axle hub here. So your kit's going to come with these studs, and these are Toyota parts. I get them from Toyota, so we don't have to question the quality of these things. And there's 3 that are going to be used for our bracket, since the bracket's obviously thicker. And then the short one goes where the bracket is not. So we're going to start with our bottom front corner. That's going to use the shorter stud. And so this has like a swedged or a perforated edge just to keep it from spinning when you're tightening, because normally you wouldn't be able to even see this since it's going through the backing plate. So I'm going to line this up to where it feels like I'm engaging the splines that are already in there from this being installed. And just kind of give it some gentle taps to get it started. And we are going to have to run the nut on to suck it through and seat it. So I'll just use a couple M10 washers to give us a bearing surface. So it'll be a little more gentle on our paint. And you just go until you feel those splines starting to be sucked in, and then bring it all, and then we'll bring it all the way in. I'll take the nut off, remove our washers, and then we'll apply our Loctite and final torque this. Make sure that you do have the short stud in the correct position, because it would be kind of a bummer if you had to remove that and do it all over again. We're going to take our medium strength thread locker. We're going to put a dab just before the axle housing to give the nut a chance to kind of soak that up and distribute it over the threads. Of course, we don't want these nuts coming loose while we're driving, so this is a critical step. The fasteners in this kit are critical that you follow the instructions with the torque values and everything. I'm going to install our nut on here, and then this gets torqued to 50 foot-pounds. Nothing like taking a bath in Loctite. I don't understand why they can't make these bottles any better for what they cost. But then again, they probably make them so they leak and jam up, so you have to buy another bottle sooner. Otherwise, this would last a lifetime. So again, with that Loctite, we're going to torque this to 50 foot-pounds. And keep in mind, lubricated threads require less torque than a dry thread, and a zinc plated bolt requires less than a non-plated because zinc is a lubricant. So if you see something is torqued to 50 foot-pounds with Loctite on it, it's going to need more torque without Loctite. So here we have our bracket, and this is the piece aside from actually identifying the part numbers for these factory Toyota studs that are the perfect length, coming up with the bracket, finding the rotor that would fit and the caliper that would fit, getting everything spaced and getting our depths and everything, that is what took such an incredible amount of time. So even though this looks like a super simple little bracket, there are hundreds and hundreds of hours that went into finding and developing this. So this is going to space our caliper. It's going to give us a place to clip on our stainless braided line. And these are actually labeled, so I laser etch into these top right hand and top left hand. And of course, you always look at something from the operator's seat point of view. So from the driver's seat, right hand is the passenger side if you're in the US. So you'll find here that with the bracket on and the stud not going through, you're not going to even have enough thread sticking out to install your nut. So we're going to leave the bracket off for now, and we're just going to suck our studs through, and then we will install the bracket. So with your 3 studs installed, simply just slide this bracket over them. We'll apply our Loctite to all the studs, and we'll get these all torqued up to 50 foot-pounds. And a common misconception is you can use too much Loctite. The truth is you can actually use too little, but you can't use too much. Now I suppose you could flip these brackets if you wanted to, if for some reason you wanted the caliper on the front instead of on the rear. But I have things all set up so that it's the most ideal routing so that you can actually keep your factory hard lines and rebend them and make the stainless hose connect your factory hard lines so that you're not having to cut and reflare brake lines. The next step is we're going to slip our rotor on. It's the easy part. As you can see, that's a tight fit on there. So we can rotate it, but trying to go up and down, you don't get any movement because that is a nice, tight, centered fit. The next step is actually getting your caliper all put together. So this can be kind of tricky. It took me quite a good while to get good instructions found on how to assemble this. So you get plenty of brake caliper hardware because your pads come with it and the caliper comes with it. So you have 2 different looking pieces here. You got these guys, and you have this part that kind of flares out on one side but not the other. So this is going to go towards the outside. They press in. They're fairly tight, but they press in to this slot, and you can see this tab kind of sticking out. So this goes in this slot, and then this guy actually goes on your pad, and I couldn't tell a difference on which side it should go, so I just put it on the same side of all the pads when I threw them together. But this kind of wavy part will also go to the outside, and this just clips over your pad. So hopefully that makes sense. You can put some brake grease on these components. That's where the grease goes. But again, this will basically go in here like so, and you press it in there, and it is a tight fit. And then you can slide your calipers in, and those are pretty tricky to line up. They are a tight fit. Now the beautiful thing about this caliper is in the future you can just pop these two bolts out, which allows you to service your pads without having to unbolt the main bolts to the bracket. So that leaves us with these two larger bolts. I'm going to start one just to hold the caliper in place while we install and torque our other bolt. You can also throw some washers on your lug studs and install a couple lug nuts. Help keep your rotor on if you want. But for this bolt, we're just going to apply Loctite on the tip of the bolt because that's the only part that's actually going to thread in to anything. And I like to put 2 dabs on about 180 degrees apart. Make sure we get plenty of distribution. You're going to thread these in and they get torqued to 91 foot-pounds. I'm going to start both of them before I torque either one of them. And as far as wrench sizes go, it's 14 millimeters for the nuts, 17 millimeters for the larger caliper bolts. Now, just in case I forgot to mention it, my custom bracket is made from high-strength steel. I do zinc plate it, so we have as much rust protection on all of our parts in this kit as we can get in 2025. And this is the larger size of Toyota hub. There's a smaller one, but I have a link on the webpage for Summit Racing. They make these simple little plastic indexing hub adapters. So basically it fits over your smaller hub and upsizes it so that this rotor fits tightly over the adapter, and it's not a spacer for the wheel, it's just a spacer so that the rotor lines up concentrically on your hub. And they're very inexpensive. I think they're like $10. The last part is going to be our hose and this caliper. We will mount the line in here. This will end up basically, it twists around, and then I made this, so this guy goes in here like so, and then this brake clip locks it in place, and that line is the correct threads, so it connects to our factory hard line. I'm going to leave that part of my project for a different day when I do the proportioning valve and shock mounts and a bunch of other stuff when I have this up on the lift. So that is it, guys. That's the installation. I think it's pretty simple. I know this video is long. It probably won't even take you as long. I did a lot of talking, so I hope this makes more sense now that you can see a video of it. And I appreciate your guys' business and your support, especially with all the time that it took to develop this kit. I think you guys are really going to love it, especially the serviceability of being able to just take this rotor off if you ever need to, easy access to your pads, and now you can run even more backspace on your wheels than ever before. So thanks for watching. Get your orders in if you haven't already, and we'll catch you in the next video. Thanks.